We're here with Senator Minchin, who's kindly given us some time to have a chat about today's carbon tax rally. Senator, just run us through a little bit about the proceedings of what's happened today and how this is relevant to the average Australian.
Well, a group called Consumers and Taxpayers Association organised for a lot of grassroots Australians to come to Canberra today and at rallies all over Australia to protest the Labor government's carbon tax. And I think I was present, I heard my leader speak, it was a great crowd, I think a good roll up here and good. The key thing was, and I think this is the thing the Labor Party's got to understand, these were ordinary grassroots Australians concerned about this tax from a whole range of points of view. One, the lie that has given vent to this tax, and B, the cost that it will impose on them as households and on Australian industry. And so it was a very powerful outpouring of, I think, grassroots anger. And that's the thing that's striking me. Australians are getting really angry about this. They feel dudded that this government has voted in on a lie, and now we're going to be taxed that will hurt Australian families and Australian businesses for no environmental gain whatsoever.
I mean, let's put aside for a moment the argument of whether this in fact will make a change to our climate change, which exists. As to whether it's attributed to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is another debate. But let's assume for a moment that it is attributed. How is imposing this carbon tax going to make a difference to world emissions when Australia maintains such a small component of those emissions?
Well, I think that's the thing a lot of ordinary Australians are now working out, that even if they do think that human beings are warming the planet, how on earth is putting a tax on ordinary Australians going to make any difference? And they're starting, I think, to increasingly understand it could actually make things worse by driving efficient industries in Australia that actually have good environmental records overseas to countries that have far lower environmental standards, where the same quantity of product will be produced but with a much higher emissions, so they get the benefit. There's more emissions and we're worse off because we've lost the jobs in the industry. And this is the thing that Australians have never bought this argument that we should sort of take the lead. The government's madly scrambling to say, there's lots of activity elsewhere. All they can do is cite the EU with its, sort of busted ass old emissions trading scheme that clearly isn't working very well. They lie about what's going on in China. China is closing down old, inefficient coal-fired power plants, but it's replacing them at a rate of knots with more efficient coal-fired power plants. So they're completely trying to deceive. So, Australia's not going to be sold a pup on this. They understand that, us taking action ahead of the rest of the world is just...
Who will be paying for this? I mean, if we look, for example, at the things that have been suggested, we're talking about different incentives and, compensations that are provided to certain demographics. So who's the ones that are going to be hit home with this tax? Is it going to be our lower income earners, our sort of middle class, or is it going to be the high income earners and business owners?
Well, inevitably it's middle Australia. Whenever these things happen, whenever Labor governments come in and want to put a tax on something, it's middle Australia that gets hurt. They can probably compensate, really low income earners and people on welfare, but it's ordinary Australian families with kids and 1.5 salary earners paying a mortgage and having to pay for the petrol and everything else and living in the suburbs and air conditioning and things like that. They're the ones who are going to pay. They won't get any compensation. Their electricity prices will go up, their petrol prices are going to go up, their gas prices will go up, and they'll be the ones who end up paying. The thing that scares me most, coming from a manufacturing state like South Australia, is the impact on manufacturing industry in this country, which staggers me that a Labor government, which professes to support manufacturing and the people who work in them, are being so cavalier about the future of manufacturing in this country with this tax. I mean, that really frightens me and they don't seem to get it.
What about the people who are advocating this policy? It seems a little hypocritical to me, the fact that, let's look for example at their jet setting around the country. They're jet setting around the country, emitting huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. Could they not be conducting their meetings over Skype and other technologies?
Well, they should if they were serious. I mean, it's the same thing. They are hypocrites. They engage in lots of activities that create CO2 emissions, But at the same time, you know, both the Labor Party and the Greens are guilty of this. They say that this is, you know, the greatest moral issue of our time and we've got to save the planet. But they refuse to consider the only known source of baseload power with zero emissions, which is nuclear power. I mean, and we should hold them to account on that, you know, that they must be complete and utter hypocrites. And they try to fool people into believing that, you know, wind and solar are going to fill the gap. So this is the point. This is what's so stupid about this. There is no point in trying to raise the price of energy produced from fossil fuels unless there is a ready, low-emission alternative to fill the gap. There simply isn't if you rule out nuclear. It doesn't exist. That's why this is a complete madness.
So you're suggesting that we should be considering nuclear. Is there any? Is
Well,
that what you're suggesting?
No, I'm not. I'm pointing to their hypocrisy.
Right, okay.
Because I personally am not at all convinced that human emissions of CO2 are adding to global warming. My view is this country's greatest natural benefit is hundreds and hundreds of years of the best source of energy known to man, and that is coal. And we should take advantage of that. And nuclear cannot compete with coal and won't be able to compete with coal for a very, very long time on cost grounds unless we so penalise coal as to make nuclear viable. And I think that, from Australia's point of view, would be incredibly stupid. But for those who do believe we should penalise coal, their hypocrisy is exposed for all to see when they rule out nuclear as the alternative.
So where is your position on how climate change should be addressed?
Well, you know, I have a long-standing record as someone who remains to be convinced about the theory of anthropogenic global warming. Now, I accept that my party has a position which is to agree to the target of 25% in 2020 and to have a policy of essentially on-budget expenditures to assist in a the most cost-effective fashion to reduce emissions. That is a much, much better approach than putting a tax on Australian households and Australian industry. And if we're going to subscribe to that emissions reduction target, then the coalition policy is a much better way of achieving it. But, you know, I'm on record as personally not being convinced that human emissions are a problem, and even if they are, that anything Australia does will make any difference whatsoever. And we should, my personal view, not do anything here unless there is a comprehensive global treaty. That means that any action we take will not leave us worse off and will in fact reduce emissions globally.
No, thank you very much.
Pleasure.